So in the last video, we talked about the basic structure of the legal memorandum, and we noted that there are traditionally five sections: your statement of facts, statement of issues, a short answer, an analysis, and then a conclusion. And at that time, I told you that the most important section was the analysis section. And in this video, we're going to be talking about how to write a good analysis section in a legal memorandum. So, let's talk about the analysis section. And so in the last video, we talked about how a legal memorandum is going to be analyzing claims, and each claim should have a corresponding issue statement, and then each issue statement should have a corresponding subdivision in the analysis section. Now, now we're going to extend that and say that each subdivision in your analysis section should also have a roadmap. And so let's talk about how to make a roadmap. A roadmap, it needs to accomplish four things. So first, you want to state a conclusion. State the conclusion with regard to the claim. Okay? And in this conclusion, you're going to state whether you believe that the claim that you're analyzing has merit. And so this is a bottom line conclusion. And in addition to this, you also want to signal uncertainty. Okay, and so that usually means either probably, or if you're more certain, then likely. Okay, and so you want to include one of these signals in your conclusion. So you can say something like, our affirmative defense of necessity is probably going to succeed, or it probably has merit. And if you're more certain, then you can use the term likely. And if you're even more certain, then you can use the term most likely. But that's the important part, is that you state your bottom line conclusion and then you signal what level of uncertainty you have in your conclusion. Remember that the law is about prediction, and a legal memorandum should be somewhat like a weather forecast. Most of the claims that you analyze, you will not be 100% certain on. You are dealing with probabilities. The second item that a roadmap needs to include is an introduction to the elements of the claim. Okay, so if a claim has four elements, you first state your conclusion and then you say there are four elements to this claim, and then you list them out. Once you have done that, then you dispose the obvious elements. Okay, so a lot of times a claim will have certain elements that are not seriously subject to dispute. So sometimes those are like what date the incident occurred, the identity of the person who is the subject of the lawsuit, what jurisdiction the incident occurred in. Those types of elements are often not really subject to serious dispute. So in this third item of the roadmap, you just dispose of those elements and say these elements are not subject to serious dispute. And then you go on and you are going to transition from the roadmap into a CREAC, and each CREAC is going to analyze one element and one element that has not been disposed of as obvious. So the non-obvious elements, each non-obvious element gets its own CREAC. So now let's get into the CREAC. So again, we keep in mind that one element gets one CREAC. And you analyze a claim one element at a time. And so let's go ahead and get the acronym for CREAC out of the way. So CREAC stands for conclusion, rule, explanation, or this can also stand for examples. A is for application, and then C is for conclusion again. Now, there is one point I want to make because there is a competitor to the CREAC, which is the IRAC. And IRAC stands for issue, rule, application, conclusion. And the point that I want to make is that obviously you can see some similarities in these two. So both of them have a conclusion, and they both have an application, and they both have a rule. But fundamentally, IRAC and CREAC are the same thing. One difference would be this explanation section in the CREAC, which does not appear in the IRAC, but that is just because IRAC does not consider the rule to be different than the explanation, and the CREAC just breaks the rule section down into two parts. But even if you use an IRAC, your rule would still want to include both the general rule and then the explanation and examples of the rule being applied. And so that leaves the only real difference being this conclusion, this initial conclusion with the issue. But these are also the same thing because a conclusion is just an answer to an issue. In other words, a conclusion statement is just the answer to the issue statement written as a complete sentence. And my general tip on whether to use IRAC or CREAC is I would say that IRAC is a better method to use for exam questions. Because when you are writing an exam question, you often don't know what your conclusion is going to be until after you've gone through your analysis. But in something like a legal memorandum, where you're generally going to have a separate section for a statement of issues, it doesn't really make sense to restate the issue in the analysis section. So I would recommend using CREAC for more formal legal writings, and then you can use IRAC for exam questions where you just need to do a quick analysis. But fundamentally, they are the same thing. Okay, so let's now get into the different sections of the CREAC. So the conclusion part of the CREAC is going to state a conclusion with respect to an element. Okay, so in your roadmap, you had a conclusion regarding the claim. In the CREAC, you're going to state a conclusion with regard to an element, and remember to signal uncertainty by using either the word probably or likely. Now, for the rule portion of the CREAC, you include the constitutional, statutory, regulatory, or common law rule that governs the issue that you are analyzing. And so this rule section is often very concise. It states a very general principle of law. And then when you get into the explanation and example section, you include the case law that has interpreted the constitutional, statutory, regulatory, or common law rule. The case law regarding rule. Okay. But there is also another thing that you want to include in this explanation section, and that is the examples. So I'm actually going to just write another E. So examples in the form of case illustrations. Okay. And so what is a case illustration? So a case illustration is an example of a prior court applying the rule in another case. Okay, so living in a common law jurisdiction where case law is very important. In this example section, you want to include cases that have previously applied the rule that you are analyzing. And so in order to do this, you want to include a couple different things. So first you want to introduce the case, and in particular, what relevance this example case, this case illustration has to the rule that you are analyzing. And then you want to state the trigger facts of that case. And trigger facts should be a narrower subset of the essential facts that we talked about to include in your statement of facts. The trigger facts are literally just the bare bones of the case. What facts triggered the holding in the court? And then you include the holding. And so the number of case illustrations to include in this example section is not a hard and fast rule, but I think that the ideal number is 3. And of these 3, you'd ideally want to have one case that is the most similar to the case that you are analyzing. One case that showcases the maximum reach of the law or of the rule. So one case that shows a court extending the rule to the furthest reach of any other case. And then one case that showcases the outer bounds. And so one case where someone asked the court to reach a little bit further, and then the court said no. And so this third case should showcase a failure of the rule. This one should showcase a success of the rule. And then the case that is the most similar to yours might be either a failure or success. Okay, so this example portion of the rule explanation has the case illustrations, and a case illustration should include a quick introduction to the case, just signaling why the case is important, what proposition the case stands for. You include the bare bones trigger facts of the case, exactly what facts led to the court's holding, and then you include what the court held. Ideally, you want to have three case illustrations, one with a case that's most similar to yours, one with the case that shows the maximum reach of the rule, and one case that shows what the outer bounds of the rule is. That is a case where someone asked the court to extend the rule even further and the court said no. Now, the reality is that you may not have enough case law in order to include three case illustrations. If, for instance, you're dealing with a case of first impression where there is no case law on the rule that you are analyzing, you could try to include case citations on some sort of analogous rule in order to draw a useful comparison, but that may or may not be worthwhile, and so you may have to use discretion on this number. Sometimes you won't get to three. Uh, Sometimes you won't get to three simply because there isn't enough case law. There are also some times where it might be worthwhile to include more than three. If you have multiple cases that sort of analyze the rule from slightly different perspectives, it's also okay to have more than three. But I think that three is the ideal number. So now that we have dealt with the rule and explanation section, let's talk about the application section. So your application section will flow fairly naturally if you keep in mind two rules. That in your application section, you want to have no new facts. In other words, all of the facts that you are using in your application section were previously disclosed in your statement of facts. And then you want to have no new law, because all of your law has been disclosed in the rule/explanation section. And if you keep in mind these two rules, your application section should flow fairly naturally, where you are simply applying all of the rules that you've disclosed in your rule and explanation section to the facts that have been previously disclosed in your statement of facts. And the goal of your application section is number one, to explain why your conclusion is correct, and also to explain why the opposite conclusion is incorrect. And in this second portion, you want to address best argument to the contrary. So, in other words, get in the mind of your opponent, someone who is going to oppose your conclusion, and think about what their best argument is that your conclusion is wrong, and explain why that conclusion is inferior to your conclusion. And then finally, for the final conclusion of your CREAC, you just restate the initial conclusion. And this is how you do a CREAC.